Washington Journal continues.
We're joined by Inez Stepman, Senior Policy Analyst at the Independent Women's Forum, and we're here to talk about efforts to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Inez, good morning.
Good morning to you.
So first of all, tell us what the Independent Women's Forum is.
So we are a 501c3, that means a nonpartisan organization, and we work on all kinds of issues. So our underlying assumption and belief is that all issues are women's issues. So we don't focus on just the issues that you might think are sort of traditional women's issues. We focus on foreign policy, economic issues, and we're in the business of looking for policy solutions that actually help women. They're not just well-intentioned, but actually help women on the ground, real consequences.
So remind our viewers what happened in the House this week with the Equal Rights Amendment.
That's right. So earlier this week on Thursday, the House voted to dissolve the deadline that they had imposed first in 1972, imposing that deadline to 1979. And then controversially, which not everybody agrees that it was a legal thing for them to do, then they actually moved by simple majority vote that deadline to 1982. We are now in 2020, obviously, so both of those deadlines have long expired. And so what this is, act by the House was to dissolve that deadline and then to completely make it open-ended and say that we can ratify this amendment over any length of time.
Now, you've written in the Federalist an article that's entitled, "Democrats Rush to Damage Women's Rights with Deceptive Equal Rights Amendment." Now, what did you mean by deceptive?
So what I mean by deceptive is I think that this is being sold as, this is about basic legal equality between men and women. And indeed, in polls, we see that 80-90% of the American people agree that men and women should be equal under the law. So this is, sounds uncontroversial. The problem is that we already have legal equality between men and women in this country. So women and men, nobody suggests, for example, that women do not have the right to speak, the right to worship, to bear arms, any of the right to a jury trial, any of the other rights in the Constitution, and then, of course, the 19th Amendment protects women's right to vote. We're equal under the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, and federal and state law forbid sex discrimination. So we already have legal equality. The question then is what changes with the ERA? And what changes is we move from legal equality to the law being rigid and unable to recognize situations in which the differences between men and women matter. Right. So and I'm sure we'll get into a lot of these different examples. But fundamentally, I worry that this ERA will replace the equality under the law that women already enjoy in this country with a sort of sameness or interchangeability between men and women that could actually put women in harm's way.
Give us an example of what you're talking about.
Sure. So, for example, we have laws, spousal Social Security benefits, right? If you stay home, and the vast majority of those who stay home are women who stay home to take care of their kids. That law amounts to a subsidy, according to some proponents of the ERA, for stay-at-home mothers, and therefore is a violation of the equality principle, even though it no longer says men and women, it just says spousal Social Security support. So that could be infirm. Further, you could talk about, that frequently what comes up is the idea of co-ed bathrooms, especially in public facilities, right? So public schools, universities currently have men and women's sports teams, right? We're in the middle of this huge debate about men who say they identify as women, but this would make all of that sort of moot, right? That debate moot, because you wouldn't have to identify as the opposite sex. You would just say, I'm a man and I want to run on the women's track team, and it's a discrimination based on sex to keep me out. So what I worry is that the parameters of what equality means will be removed from the public discourse, placed into the courts, where it's very, very difficult to change if the American people aren't happy with that result.
Now, one of the things you wrote in your article says, if it chooses to strip the deadline and move the ERA forward, the House will be moving us closer to a future where the law is unable to distinguish between men and women, to the detriment of both. That's what you were just talking about just then, correct?
Yes. So right now, our legal regime, the one I just laid out with the Equal Protection Clause, federal and state law, protects women against discrimination, but it doesn't forbid the law from taking into account some common sense situations in which it is perfectly appropriate to treat men and women differently. For example, in prisons, right? There's an obvious reason why we don't put female prisoners in with males. Why? Because women are uniquely physically vulnerable in a situation where they're in a prison with males. That's a common sense exception to the general dictate to treat men and women exactly the same and equally, right? So what I worry is that the ERA is going to take away that flexibility, the ability to recognize the fact that we are different biologically. There are important differences between men and women. We might be equal, but treating us exactly the same is both against common sense and could actually be dangerous for women.
Now, California Democrat Jackie Speier, who was one of the sponsors of the legislation to remove that deadline, talked about her attempts for the ERA on the floor of the House on Thursday. Here's what she had to say.
This is very simple, members. Women want to be equal, and we want it in the Constitution. I am equal on this House floor with all of my male colleagues, but when I walk out, I have fewer rights and protections than them. I rise today because the women of America are done being second-class citizens. We are done being paid less for our work, done being violated with impunity, done being discriminated against for our pregnancies, done being discriminated against simply because we are women. The ERA is about equality. The ERA is about sisterhood, motherhood, survival, dignity, and respect. The world recognizes this. Of the 193 countries in the United Nations, 165 have put this kind of language in their constitutions, but not the United States of America. From the Women's March to the Me Too movement to the Pink Wave, the outrage we've seen among women is because we have been disrespected, devalued, and diminished in our society. And we are fed up. It's no wonder recent votes to ratify the ERA came in 2017, 2018, and 2020, because we want the ERA now.
Go ahead and respond to Representative Speier there.
Sure. So first off, I would say that women in 2020 are actually doing really well in America. If we look at just about any measure in American society, so we're experiencing the lowest unemployment rates among women since the 50s, so records since we started keeping these records, lowest unemployment rates. Women hold the majority of wealth in this country. They actually own more wealth in this country than men. And very relevantly to what she's talking about, women hold enormous political power in the United States because we make up the majority of virtually every modern election, right? As in there are more women voting and voted in all previous elections in modern political history, more women have voted than men. And that's exactly why we should trust the American people to deal with some of these public policy questions. So I just disagree with the premise of the representative there that women are somehow second-class citizens. As I said, I do believe that women already have full legal equality under the law in the United States, and I disagree that we're victims in 2020. We simply are not. We're doing very well.
Once again, I want to read a little bit from your article and have you react to what you're saying here. So you say here that under the ERA, if it passes, public school restrooms and locker rooms remain, for the most part, sex-specific, as do women and men's sports teams at public universities. To the extent that transgender students are controversially allowed to flout that bifurcation, they present a tiny percentage of exceptions. The ERA could make all public women-only spaces, dormitories, and teens completely co-ed, relieving mediocrely talented male athletes and typical 15-year-old boys of the burden of having to claim to be transgender to blow female competitors out of the water and hang out in the ladies' shower. Further, any female or male-specific program that receives government grants could be at risk. Say farewell to battered women's shelters and girls' STEM or coding courses. You see that as a possibility if the ERA gets approved?
Right, because each one of those things is an instance of discrimination based on sex, right? We talk about the word discrimination in our common parlance as okay, that's bad discrimination, right? But under the law, there are thousands and thousands of discriminations on the basis of 1,000 different qualities, and we restrict those that are impermissible to a small category. But each one of those things that you just listed is, in the legal sense, a discrimination based on sex. When a man wants to join the women's track team, that is a discrimination on the basis of sex when a public university says that he cannot. And so that's, in that piece, I was trying to point out that we're having this huge debate, right, over essentially what are exceptions. We're talking about how to accommodate transgender students in public schools and so on. But the ERA would make all of that debate sort of moot, right? Because it would just, you wouldn't have to identify as a woman in order to use the ladies' locker room. You could just be a typical 15-year-old boy who would like to see the ladies' locker room and say, you can't keep me out. That's a discrimination based on sex.
Let's let our viewers join this conversation. We're going to open up special lines for this talk. So if you support the passage of the ERA, we want you to call 202-748-8000. If you oppose the passage of the ERA, your number is going to be 202-748-8001. And keep in mind, you can always text us your opinion at 202-748-8003. And we're always reading on social media, on Twitter at C-SPAN-WJ and on Facebook at facebook.com/C-SPAN. So let's go to our first caller. It's going to be CD, who's calling from Florence, Kentucky. And CD supports the ERA. CD, good morning.
How you doing? I believe the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment defines us as a secular nation. Having said that, living under a Constitution provides us sovereignty, anonymity, and privacy for how we live our lives, meaning that as a male, I have full right over my body, my health care. Women should have that too. As we saw with Roe v. Wade and the contraceptive battles with the Supreme Court in the 60s. But there are lines, and that's up to the individual. Woman has a right to say no to sex, to have privacy while using the toilet or take a shower. So, yes, these lines are privacy is just that, constitutionally established. And that's really all I have to say.
So first of all, you mentioned privacy, and you did mention, for example, showers and bathrooms. And I agree that women have the right to have women-only spaces, right? And earlier in my article, you listed some of the consequences of eliminating women-only spaces. But there are also a lot of women-only spaces that get grants from local governments, from state governments, or from federal governments. From the federal government, and those spaces could also be at risk, right? So we're talking about battered women's shelters, most of which receive some form of grant from the government. That's exactly the kind of privacy that I'm worried would be at risk if we were to pass the ERA, because those spaces are often only for women and they exclude men. Similarly, we have programs that encourage girls, for example, to go into the STEM fields or to learn how to code. A lot of those programs receive, in some form or another, government grants. Those programs then would be at risk because, again, if a program is aimed at women and only admits girls into a coding program, a special coding program for girls, that is a discrimination based on sex. So really, these are exactly the kinds of programs that I would be worried would be jeopardized under an ERA.
Let's talk to John, who's calling from Troy, Michigan, and John opposes the ERA. John, good morning.
Well, the reason I oppose the ERA is the reason I oppose most people who say they want equal rights, because when you look at it pragmatically, they really don't want equal rights. They want preferential treatment, and that goes for any protected class or any class of citizen that wants to differentiate themselves from the general public. And that's my comment.
So I think in this case, what we're looking at is whether men and women are exactly the same or ought to be treated exactly the same in every instance. And we can be equal without having special privileges, right? We can be equal without having exactly the same treatment in any particular circumstance. Now, in the vast majority of cases, right, those differences are not relevant to whatever we're talking about, right? If we're talking about who can be an astronaut or a chemist, of course, men and women can both be astronauts and chemists, and the differences, the biological differences between them do not matter in those applications. But if we're talking about prisons or girls coding or battered women's shelters or all the examples that I've listed, suddenly the biological differences between men and women actually do matter. And so what I worry about is that the ERA will take away the flexibility of our law to recognize that sometimes it's okay to treat men and women differently or to separate them because they are biologically different.
Now, the co-president and CEO of the ERA Coalition, Carol Jenkins, was on this show yesterday. Here's what she said.
This enhances, this push for equality for women and gives it a fundamental right in federal cases, because so many cases go all the way to the Supreme Court. Justice will decide there's no ground for it here, so it's rejected out of hand. But this would permanently enshrine the rights of girls and women in the Constitution, and that's what we need. Again, I say just look around, look at pregnancy. Women who are pregnant are still being fired, every day in this country because they're considered a handicap to whatever workplace they may be in, while adjustments are being made in many cases for the men, who may have a bad back or, some legal thing that will keep them from working. They're given a replacement, a desk job, things like that. So, I think that we have to look at the evidence of the status of women in America, and we know that it is substandard, and we believe that the only way of fixing it, we've tried everything else during this century of working for the ERA, and it has not worked. We have, yes, made progress, but nowhere near the equal status that women and girls deserve in this country. So it requires something radical. It requires something big and fundamental, and that's what the ERA is.
Go ahead and respond to her there.
Sure. So as I said, I disagree with the underlying premise that the status of women is somehow substandard in the United States. But specifically, right, she talked about pregnancy discrimination. Pregnancy discrimination is already illegal under federal and state law. Now, to the extent that it happens, of course, there are instances of it, but women can already take those companies to court. And in a similar way as they'd be able to take them sensibly, as Carol says, under the ERA. The difference is that the ERA is much broader than that, right? Another objection that is often brought up is to prove the substandard sort of class of women, or women being a substandard category in the United States, is the so-called pay gap. But there's a ton of evidence that the pay gap is the result of free choices by women that on aggregate they make differently than men. So back in 2009, the Obama Labor Department overtook a large meta study of all of the surveys that have been done, all of the work that has been done in social science to study the pay gap. And they concluded that it's not, 20 cents. It's not that it shrinks down to 2 cents, and that they could not determine that final 2 cents was the result of discrimination. In other words, women choose more flexible hours often over higher pay. They make different decisions about college majors than men do. And that's fine. It is fine that on average, women and men make different choices because we are different, and that's fine. The only thing that isn't fine is actual discrimination, where a woman or a man, frankly, is told you cannot do this because of your sex. But that is already illegal in the United States and has been for decades and decades.
Let's talk to Susan, who's calling from California. Susan, and she opposes the passage of the ERA. Susan, good morning.
Yes, I agree with Inez. There are a lot of common sense things that a lot of the women in Congress do not consider.
Like what, Susan?
Like what? Okay, I had twins. My husband went back to work. I didn't. And I already had another son. So, and pay. A lot of my friends are getting very high pay. We have everything we've ever wanted. We can vote. We get good paychecks. We get the hours we want. And even if I worked as a temporary, they always made hours for me. They were willing to adjust just so I would be there. They did anything I wanted just so I would be there.
Go ahead and respond.
Oh, I absolutely agree that the status of women overall in this country is very, very good. And in fact, in many ways, we're outstripping men, right? Women get the majority of college degrees, for example, and that's a gap that seems to be widening. There's going to be more women with college degrees in the future than men. And then when we look at actually similarly situated pay for men and women, for example, for people who do not have children and are younger, women actually make 7 or 8% more in the same way that the wage gap is calculated, right? Which is average overall salaries, median salaries for men, median salaries for women. Again, that's not really reflective of people who are similarly situated doing the exact same job. And to the extent that a pay gap opens up between men and women, it's because women make different choices overall than men. In this free country, they are allowed to do that. There's no reason that we should be suspicious of the fact that women make different choices. It's fine and good that women make different choices than men. And again, actually, the ERA and a lot of the rhetoric around it is set in opposition to the revealed preferences of what women actually want, which are often different than men. And it's a beautiful thing, the fact that we're all different. And as long as there is no actual discrimination, which, as I said, is forbidden under state law, is forbidden under federal law, and is forbidden by the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution already, there is no reason to suspect that women are second-class citizens. That was another phrase that was used a lot on the House floor on Thursday.
You start off your article by saying on Monday evening, feminist legal icon Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg repeated her view that advocates for the Equal Rights Amendment, among whom she counts herself an enthusiastic member, have to start from the beginning in the ratification process. So let's take a quick look at the history of the ERA, and let's talk about whether this whole conversation is moot. So the ERA originally was passed in March of 1972, and it required approval by legislatures in 3/4 of the states by March 1979. But in 77, only 35 state legislatures had approved. And like we said earlier, in 1978, Congress extended the ratification deadline to 1982. Like you said, it's 2020. And it seems like Ruth Bader Ginsburg agrees with you that this entire process needs to start over from scratch. So is the argument going on in Congress really moot legally since the ERA didn't meet its deadline?
Well, we'll find out in the courts. But yes, so Ruth Bader Ginsburg has repeatedly said, one, that she supports very strongly the ERA. She supported that as a lawyer before she went on the court. But two, that this process is illegitimate. And exactly the conversation that we're having now about this is why this process is so illegitimate, right? Because what we saw with the ERA was an initial overwhelming support, right? We got 2/3 of both houses of Congress. We had both political party platforms supporting the ERA. And then Phyllis Schlafly came out and made some of the arguments against it, and she convinced people exactly of a similar underlying premise as I'm making now, which is we want the law to be able to recognize the differences between men and women in some limited circumstances. And the American people were swayed by that argument, and they chose not to ratify it. Additional states stopped ratifying, and the ERA died, right? That's how that process should work, because our amendment process is supposed to reflect a overwhelming support among the American people for adding something to the highest law of our land. And in order to do that, we need the time to actually have this national conversation, to have this debate. And this illegitimate process, this very truncated process, right, which has essentially started just in 2016 and involved 3 states and now the House and eventually the Senate, that is not a long enough time for us to have a fully fleshed out conversation about the consequences of the ERA the way that we did back in the 1970s.
Now, I have to point out that the ERA fell 3 states short of ratification, but since then, Nevada and Illinois have ratified it since 2017, which is probably why we're having this debate, because only one more state needs to ratify it if you consider the entire process to be still ongoing, correct?
So just one addition, Virginia did ratify just several weeks ago. So according to their counts, which I argue are not legitimate, but according to proponents' counts, they say that they have achieved the 38 states necessary to ratify, and that the final barrier will be to dissolve that deadline imposed by Congress in the Senate, since they just dissolved it in the House.
Let's talk to Damien, who's calling from Brooklyn, New York, and Damien supports the ERA. Damien, good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Well, first of all, the fact that 38 states have passed an ERA amendment is a sign that it's pretty damn popular, since more states in the union support it than don't. Second of all, my son is a transgender person and is 5 years old, has been adamant about being a girl since the age of 2, whereas Pink plays with girls and the dolls, Elsa, Frozen, you name it, has no interest in trackers. And this is a person who will probably later in life be using a woman's bathroom. And I just can't, the logic that somehow this population of people who are genuinely transgender are going to usurp the right, the opportunities of women for coding schools and other things is just ridiculous. It's like, and on the other hand, as if a boy is going to put on a dress and go apply for a coding school to get the discount. You know, it's like, I don't think that's going to happen. And these fears about this stuff is just ridiculous. They treat like just putting on a dress and calling yourself a girl is some kind of fad, which will get in the way when being transgender is as real as being gay. So, I just these strange fears. Why not pass it? What's the harm? You know.
Go ahead and respond.
Okay, so I heard 3 points there, so I'll address them in turn. One, the popularity of the ERA. That's part of the problem here with this process, right? So we have 38 states, but first of all, 5 of those states have rescinded in some way or another, have rescinded their support for the ERA and de-ratified, and that's actually another legal issue that will be at play should the Senate dissolve the deadline, is the status of the 5 states that have taken back their approval. But that's kind of the point, right? They approved this back in the 1970s, right? The conversation was incredibly different, and one way in which it was different is the addition of the confusion over what the word sex actually means in the text of this amendment, right? So that's why we should not be having these approval battles over the course of 5 decades, the way that the ERA is. We should have one, actual continuous time where the American people decide whether the overwhelming majority of us want to add this to the Constitution, right? So we have 2 totally different electorates back, 50 years ago and today. So we're not talking about overwhelming popularity of the ERA today. We're talking about it, over the course of decades. So that's part of the problem with the ratification process. So with regard to the transgender issue, we're having this debate in our country right now, right? How can we accommodate the needs of transgender people and still make sure that the women's right to privacy and to have their own spaces and bathrooms and locker rooms, et cetera, how do we balance those 2 things? I think the ERA goes much further than balancing those 2 things. You wouldn't have to put on a dress, right, to go into these women's spaces. You would just demand access, not as a trans woman, but as a man, a cisgender man, right? Because it would be a discrimination based on sex. So actually, I think to some extent, right, we're having this whole debate over how to accommodate transgender people, and it's a quite vociferous debate, right, in this country. But the ERA actually blows that entire debate out of the water, because you wouldn't have to identify as a woman to have access to women's sports teams. You could just walk on right on the team, because keeping you out would be a discrimination based on sex.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Virginia ratified its version of the ERA in January, and some female legislators in the Assembly wrote this op-ed in the Washington Post, I believe. Though the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause is often cited in arguments against sex discrimination, courts accept a lesser level of justification for laws that discriminate based on sex than they will when race discrimination is at issue. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia argued that the 14th Amendment was drafted to establish equality for freed slaves, not to extend equal protection to women or any other group. Without language specifically affirming gender equality in the U.S. Constitution, states and federal protections for women can be too easily repealed, limited, or not properly enforced. What's your reaction to that?
So I think it's proper that we have a lower standard for discrimination based on sex than based on race, and I'll explain why. That is exactly the flexibility that is necessary to recognize some of these very real common sense distinctions between men and women. Whereas in race, we don't have that argument, at least not in this century, right? That there are biological reasons where people of different races should be treated differently, right? But the biological differences between men and women are very real. Women are weaker, for example, physically weaker. Not overall, to be clear, physically weaker than men, and that's why, for example, they become vulnerable if you put them in a male's prison. So exactly those kinds of rationales, that's not an acceptable rationale. For example, we don't segregate prisons by race. Because there isn't that biological rationale to segregate prisons by race. So that's what she means when it sounds bad when you say it has a lower standard, but I would call it a flexible standard to actually recognize that in some limited instances, treating men and women differently is actually the common sense thing to do and actually protects women and girls.
Let's go back to the phone lines and let's talk to Jeff, who's calling from Warren, Michigan, and Jeff opposes the ERA. Jeff, good morning.
Hey, how you doing today?
Just fine. Go ahead.
First, I want to thank you for taking my call, and I want to apologize to your screener because I got a little flustered. I called in on the wrong line, and that's the one I got through. But I told her I supported it. I didn't support it because of the athletes get to work together and everything. But like I said, I got a little flustered. But I have a daughter that is in a female for-profit prison, and there is already a male in there, and because he thinks he's a woman. But he's running around there with no clothes on, all his junk hanging out, and like I said, it's already happening. So...
Go ahead and respond.
Yeah, so like I said, we're having this debate already in the specific context of people who are biologically one sex and then claim to be another sex. And however that debate plays out, I mean, I can give you my views on it. I don't think it's appropriate to put in a biological man into a woman's prison exactly because it endangers women and girls when they're put in with biological men. But at the end of the day, we are talking about how to accommodate a very small number of people when we're talking about the transgender debate. The ERA would blow all of that out of the water, right? You don't have to identify as a woman to run on a women's track team or to wrestle, for example, or to box with women. We're seeing that again in the transgender context. We're seeing that in mixed martial arts, that we have a biological man who is boxing with women and putting them in the hospital, right? Because men are stronger than women. So we're having this debate in this very limited context around transgender accommodation, but under the ERA, that almost becomes the smallest of the tip of the iceberg, right? Because you don't even have to identify. You can just say, hey, I want admission to mixed martial arts to fight against women because keeping me out is a discrimination based on sex.
Let's talk to Juanita, who's calling from Cincinnati, Ohio, and Juanita supports ERA. Juanita, good morning.
Good morning. How are you? In all deference and all respect to your guest, she hasn't said one word about black women. She hasn't said one word about black women in the debate about the ERA and why we feel we need it. Now, I did not choose to be born a woman. I did not choose to be born black. I did not choose to work at University of Cincinnati for 30 years and suffer not only discrimination behind white men, but white women as well. Now, I'm talking about salary. Black women already are making less than white women, Hispanic women, and probably some other people, too. I see the ERA as a vehicle, as an economic vehicle for us. She has not said anything about that. I don't think she said anything about that in her article, nor is she offering any solutions to get to solve the problem. And I want to hear what she has to say. Thank you.
Go ahead and respond.
Thanks for that question. So when you look at, again, these disparities based on pay, we're looking at median salaries broken down either by men and women or by racial categories, which is much more complicated. And I admit that I don't study the breakdown, economic breakdown between different racial categories in the United States, and that could have all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with the ERA. The ERA would not solve, quote unquote, the pay gap between men and women, because the pay gap between men and women, as opposed to different kinds of discriminations based on race, the pay gap between men and women is largely the result of women's choices. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that women choose to be paid less. Of course, nobody chooses to be paid less. But women tend to value flexibility, for example. They value different kinds of college majors. They choose to go into different kinds of college majors. So, for example, there are vastly more women who are majoring in sociology than are majoring in petroleum engineering. That is a male-dominated major. And women make those choices. These are women going into college. They are less interested in petroleum engineering than men, as it turns out. But, of course, there are female petroleum engineers, and they go on and they have higher pay scales than the women who major in sociology. So these are largely questions of preference and choice, and it's perfectly okay. I'm not bothered by the fact that overall men and women are making average salaries that are different, because those are reflective of the choices that they've made rather than discrimination. And I would close with a single point, which is, of course, discrimination based on race is already illegal and it's unconstitutional. Discrimination based on sex is already illegal and it's unconstitutional, but our constitutional, the difference there, as we discussed a moment ago, the difference between their constitutional standards for discrimination on the basis of race, that's extremely high. Like you only, and there's the very controversial only exception is in the case of affirmative action, right? And that battle has been played out in the courts, right? But otherwise, it is not lawful for the government to discriminate on the basis of race or even to enforce a private business. That's the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? To enforce a private business's discrimination on the basis of race, right? So we have decided as a society, absolutely not acceptable, except for the controversial exception of affirmative action. In the case of women, that constitutional status gives that flexibility exactly in all the cases that I've laid out to recognize the fact that in some cases, the differences between men and women need to be recognized in order to protect women, in order to protect, in some cases, our very safety in terms of not being put in, for example, prisons with biological men or allowing biological men into battered women's shelters, for example. So the current constitutional regime has the flexibility to allow the law to take into account those differences in a very limited number of circumstances, and it should stay that way.
Before we run out of time in this segment, what is the next battlefront? We know we saw what's going on in the House. We've had some states decide to ratify, some states, like you said, pull their ratification back. Where should we be watching next for what's going to happen next with the ERA?
So a couple places. So first of all, the Senate, right? So this will go to the Senate, and they will probably take up a vote on the same question that the House considered, which is to dissolve that deadline that was imposed back in the 1970s. And then we'll watch the courts. If that happens, I hope it doesn't, but if that happens, then we'll have to watch the courts, right? So the DOJ has instructed the National Archivist not to inscribe the ERA into the Constitution because of these legal questions about the ratification procedure. And we will see those issues probably go all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Do you actually expect to see the Senate take action on this one way or the other before the November elections?
I'm not sure. I can't speak for Mitch McConnell here. I don't know when he'll decide to take this up. There will be a fight in the Senate because two Republican senators have already declared their support for the ERA. That would be Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. So there will be a tight battle in the Senate over this, and I just hope that we have the time and the opportunity to make the argument that this goes beyond legal equality and forces sameness between men and women that could actually be incredibly detrimental to women and girls in this country, especially at a time when we are actually doing very well. As I said, our unemployment numbers are lowest on record. We are the majority of the electorate. We get the majority of degrees. It's simply not true to say that women are second-class citizens in this country. We are already equal, but we do not want to be the same.
Let's see if we can get a couple more callers in before we wrap up. Let's talk to Craig, who's calling from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Craig opposes the ERA. Craig, good morning.
Yeah, I oppose the amendment. I do support women's rights, but the British thinker Malcolm Muggeridge in the 70s in an interview said, the curse of our time is that we think in categories instead of actually thinking. And if you actually think, the very people that raise up science as the new religion are actually denying science in this. There's XY and there's XX chromosomes, and those don't change. And so no matter what you call yourself, anyone, you can find out if they're XY or XX, male or female. That's just science. That's just nature saying that there are differences. Also, women have a unique and special different role from men. Men have a special role too, but women can give birth. Men can't. So even in science, you see there are different roles. And so those are not lesser or greater. They're just both very important roles. And I think we can't deny science. And the amusing thing is that actually completely agrees with the ancient writings in Scripture that, have hierarchical roles for men and women and have differences in women and men. And so it's funny how they're denying science, and in the end, all science and even ancient writings, they all agree that we are different.
Go ahead and respond.
Sure. Men and women are different. I agree with that caller, right? So we have an enormous body of evidence and scientific evidence to show that the differences between men and women are profound. So the obvious thing, of course, is that we are different biologically, physically, and then that we have different strength levels. Men have much, much more upper body strength than women. But there are all kinds of fascinating biological differences between men and women. So, for example, women have better periphery vision than men, but men have better, straight on, I don't remember what the scientific word is, but men can spot movement at a farther distance than women, but women have better periphery vision than men do, right? These are, and then the sex differences start, a lot of folks argue that those sex differences are somehow socially constructed, but those sex differences actually start in the womb, right? So we have, one of the more interesting recent studies of the last few years has been, you can identify structural brain differences between men and women while they are still in utero, right? So before a baby even comes into the world, you can differentiate between boys and girls' brains. Now, does that mean that we are unequal in some fundamental way, that we're not equally smart or capable? Of course not. We are equal. But the difference is, of course, that there are going to be consequences if we pretend that these biological differences don't exist. And unfortunately, most of those consequences will fall on women and girls and can actually endanger them.
Let's take one more caller. Oh, I think we lost our caller.
Happens.
It happens sometimes. So we'd like to thank Inez Stepman, and I want to make sure I pronounce Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum for being with us here today and talking about the ERA. Inez, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on C-SPAN.
Thank you for that as well. So coming up, we're going to take more